Welcome, everyone, to this special edition of Peter's Field Hospital, the official podcast for wherepeteris.com. I'm Mike Lewis, the managing editor, and today I'm joined by David Lafferty and a special guest, Austen Ivereigh. Austen Ivereigh is a regular contributor to a number of Catholic publications. He is a fellow in contemporary church history at the Jesuit-run Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. He is also the author of the great biography of the Holy Father, entitled The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope, as well as his most recent book, Wounded Shepherd, Francis and His Struggle to Convert the Catholic Church. Both are published by Henry Holt. Most recently, on April 8th, Wednesday of Holy Week of this year, he released a new interview that he conducted with Pope Francis. This was the first interview specifically for Catholics in the English-speaking world, and it was published in Commonweal and the Tablet. Welcome, Austen.
Hi, Mike. Hi, David.
Thank you for joining us.
I thought you'd never ask.
Well, you know, we had a few cancellations this week, so we were able to squeeze you in. Anyway, why don't we start talking about how this interview came about? You've written 2 books about Pope Francis, and you've talked a little bit about the genesis of this, but how did you have this idea?
Mike, just before I answer that, joking apart, it really is great to be on. I'm a huge admirer of Where Peter Is. I think what you guys have done is extraordinary. And, I'm very, very supportive, and it's great to be on. The interview came about it was one of these things of providence. I felt instinctively that he had something important to say about the coronavirus crisis. And I'd seen a few things that he had said. This was in mid-March to Italian and Spanish media. They weren't very long interviews, but he had said some interesting things, but I felt that he had much more to say. And I also felt, he never really speaks to the English-speaking world. And so I just wrote to him. It was a very off-the-cuff thing. And I just said it would be wonderful if he could just answer a few questions and I suggested English-speaking Catholic publication. And I got back a lovely handwritten note sent as a sort of PDF by a secretary. It just very, very sweet. But just saying, he wasn't sure. He wasn't really giving interviews at this time. I think also that at that time, and I'm talking here about kind of 20th of March, there was a lot of controversy about, should churches stay open or not. There was stories about tension between him and the Italian bishops. And I kind of got the sense from him that it wasn't the right time. So that's fine. And then, of course, he gave a few days later, a week later, on the 27th of March, he gave his extraordinary Urbi et Orbi address in St. Peter's Square. And actually, I felt that he had done there what, in a way, I was asking him to do. So I wrote him another letter saying, look, you've amazing, you've done that Urbi et Orbi, don't worry about the interview, but if you did want to still do it, I could readjust the questions. And I got another lovely note back saying, again, it sounded like no, but he said, send me the questions and let me think about it. And then I got a few days later, I got a call from his secretary saying, is it all right if he records his answers to the questions and if he could send them as an audio file? And I said, great. I had no idea that he would be sending me a 46-minute reflection of tremendous importance. And many people say the most important interview he's done. I say nothing to do with me. It just happened to be I caught him, I think, at a moment when he was discerning his way through this crisis that I think he's done since that first famous Spadaro interview in 2013. So yeah, I went from being in rural lockdown and leading a tranquil rural life to having a few very busy few days.
Maybe the first thing I would like to ask is, do you feel there's one central message that he focused on? I know that he brought up this idea of conversion, which is something that you stress in Wounded Shepherd. And I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate on how Pope Francis might be seeing this moment for the church as a moment of conversion?
Well, David, that was really what the interview was about. And that's why I think I was reaching out to him, was that I sensed that he had a deep understanding of the grace of conversion that was available to humanity at this time. And why I thought that was, well, of course, he demonstrated it very strongly in his Urbi et Orbi address. But knowing his writings as a Jesuit, and particularly his what I call his tribulation writings from the late 1980s, where he writes a lot about tribulation, distress, and about the grace of conversion on offer, and the obstacles and the temptations, that exist in that circumstance. So knowing that was in a way his template, that was how, as a Jesuit leader, he had always approached these things. I felt that that's really what he would want to, what I was interested in hearing from him about. And I think the bit in the interview, the interview is very, very wide ranging over a whole series of issues connected to the crisis. But the area of the interview where his voice slowed when I was listening to the audio, when I really felt it was coming from the depths of him, from his heart, was precisely in response to my question about an ecological conversion, whether this crisis offered the opportunity for a transformation in the way we understood society and economics. And he has this, you see in the interview, he has this long passage or meditation at the beginning of his answer where he's talking about the importance of memory and the importance of not losing this, not converting it into an anecdote. And then he mentions the first week of the spiritual exercises, which, if you know Ignatian spirituality, that's when you look back on your life and you see the grace that's been there in your life, which you probably never noticed. God was walking with you, even in your darkest moments, but only later do you come to see that. And of course, you also face up to your own sinfulness, the way you have ignored that grace, the way you have trodden on others or been very self-centered. And so his point is that I think this was a chance for us to see how we got to where we are. And that, obviously, individually, but also socially, why is it that we have this major ecological crisis? We've produced too much, we've consumed too much, as he said. So, and then this was also the moment he said, and this is when there was a very intense moment in the interview. He says, this is the moment to see the poor. Now, if you know Bergoglio's thinking, seeing, it's all about hermeneutics, what theologians call hermeneutics, the lens with which you view things. Jesus comes to change our lens, the way we view the world. And once our lens changes, then everything else changes. So he's saying we have to now see what we did not see before. What we did not see was the thing that we had excluded, or the people that we had excluded. And of course, here he mentioned Humanae Vitae and various things. So here was the moment where we understood what was really important. And I guess, so that's, I think, the heart of the interview was the opportunity for conversion in the change in the way we come to see ourselves and society as a result of this, well, frankly, this new vulnerability that we are all experiencing, but also the fact that, our economy has come to a halt, that we have time, that we're in lockdown, we're in a kind of a retreat. And so there is the possibility, in the midst of the tragedy of the virus, to incubate something new. And it's almost as if he was saying, let's not waste this opportunity. Let's not squander this.
Dialing it back a little bit, I picked up a lot of those themes, a lot of important messages that Francis gave to you. I agree. Since the Spadaro interview, I don't know that there's a single interview in which we really saw the heart of his mission. But as with many wonderful things that Francis has done, the reception, I don't think, has been particularly great. I want to give you basically two examples. What the mainstream media, CNN and so forth, took from the interview was that this pandemic was God's punishment for ignoring the environment, which wasn't the point that he was making. I don't know if you saw those headlines. And then from the Catholic media side, I noticed that none, and it's been pointed out by others, that none of the EWTN outlets even mentioned that this interview went on. You would think that such a profound statement from the Pope would get some coverage by the largest Catholic media organization in the world, especially since it was targeted towards an English language audience. But somehow they didn't deem it newsworthy, or they didn't want to give publicity to it. And of course, this speaks to larger themes surrounding the Francis papacy, Why do you think that was, or am I off base?
No. Probably the most extraordinary thing was that they decided completely to ignore it. But before I come back to that, just on your earlier part of your question was about what one might call the secular news reception of the interview. I mean, you can question my judgment, and a number of people have, in giving the interview to what one might call, two worthy, venerable, but not particularly well read Catholic journals. I mean, both Commonweal and the Tablet are wonderful institutions, but they're not what one might call, mass media. And, it could have been, frankly, it was an interview that could have been, serialized in the New York Times over Easter and reached millions of people. And so, but the thing that I was very keen on, Mike, was that I did not want it to become a news event and then be chopped up by, and I'm a journalist, I know how this works, become a whole series of media narratives. It becomes a series of headlines, which then embeds in people's minds, oh, the Pope said that. And then you spend days saying, no, he didn't say that. So the way it was released was very early in the morning. And so actually I wasn't given in advance to the mainstream press. It was available in full on the websites of Commonweal and the Tablet. And the purpose of that was that the people of God, this is what I wanted, could have access to it in its entirety. Now, I as I say, we can argue about that, but that was my intention, and that's how I wanted to play it. And what I, however, did not estimate was that it would be completely ignored by a large section of the American conservative Catholic media. Now, as a Catholic journalist, and I'm not a young guy, I'm in my 50s, I've been in this business for quite a long time. I can tell you, as a Catholic journalist, one thing you can never, ever ignore as a news story is a major intervention by the Pope on anything. That he gives a major interview, 3,000 words, to specifically directed at English-speaking Catholics, with the most profound reflection that this Pope has yet done on the major crisis facing the world at this time, and then just to pretend it doesn't even exist, I found completely and utterly extraordinary. I was just gobsmacked, frankly. And I think I tweeted something to the effect of, conservative Catholic America has been sealed off or walled off, I think I said in a tweet, from the Pope, from the papacy. And that really is how it strikes me. Now, what was so interesting about this, Mike, you and David, you're both familiar with Twitter and the way thing goes. What was fascinating was that they were completely silent. They just stayed quiet. And I think I know that there was an order from above just simply to ignore it, just pretend it doesn't exist. And that is a sad reflection, I'm afraid, of the church that we're in. It is a kind of semi-schism. I mean, there's a policy of recognize but resist. In other words, we recognize him as Pope, but we will basically resist him when he's trying to speak to us. And I think particularly, they had an excuse to do that. I mean, look, had the Pope given a speech, I don't think they would have ignored it. But because it was an interview to me, and I'm seen as, as a sort of Francis, follower, and the fact that it was given to these two, I suppose, what I might call icons of a liberal Catholic media, definitely gave them the excuse to ignore it, but I don't think it gave them the justification.
I see this incredible reluctance on the part of some in Catholic media, and particularly in the US, to not even attempt to sort of think with the Pope or think with the church in line with the Pope. And I saw that during the Amazon Synod as well. And I think this is just a repetition of that. Yeah, the only things that I really saw were, maybe a couple snarky comments about the idea of giving absolution virtually and that sort of thing. But it was incredible, the silence surrounding this.
And what was also extraordinary, David, was that it contained things which, if you were to take the interview apart and filter it through a certain ideological lens or a certain, not even religious lens, there was a lot in that. I mean, for example, what he said about Humanae Vitae, some of the strongest things he said about Humanae Vitae being prophetic about neo-Malthusianism, his very strong words on the pro-life issue, his very strong words about populism and nationalism. And, so the rule of thumb is always in journalism, you can filter something, you can report things in a particular way, you can put a slant on it, you can dispute it, you can object to it, you can have 3 opinion pieces tearing it apart. But what you can't do, in my view, if you are a Catholic medium, you can't just simply ignore it, because this is the successor of St. Peter. So, but you're right, this is part of a policy and it's part of a strategy, which has been, I'm afraid, adopted at a very high level of this corporate behemoth. And we saw it, of course, in the Amazon Synod, when very early on it was decided that the story of the Synod would be idolatry, would be that the church was somehow succumbing to pantheism and idolatry. And that was the narrative from the beginning. And basically they looked for a story that would hold that up, and they found one in these completely innocent statuettes that were bought in a market in Manaus, carved by local people, had nothing to do with any pagan religion. But they focused on that and they made that the story. And, I was there throughout the Synod. It was relentless. I mean, they had 30, 40 journalists just employed there. I mean, they dominated the press hall in terms of numbers, and just pumped out this single line day after day. So yeah, I'm afraid this is the world we now live in. This is the media environment that the church now lives in, and we have to come to terms with it.
One of the things, and I guess we could say that there's a division between the more mainstream media opponents of Pope Francis and the fringe. By the fringe, I'm talking about Church Militant, 1 Peter 5, Taylor Marshall. But EWTN and the National Catholic Register like to present themselves as wholly mainstream, and they will outwardly say, we support the Pope, we defend him, we respect him, we respect his teachings. When asked about Amoris Laetitia, they'll give the line of, well, we assent to it according to an interpretation that's in line with tradition. Yet you find them providing cover for people like Athanasius Schneider or Cardinal Burke. Cardinal Sarah is always painted as this very supportive cardinal in the Curia. It's this narrative. There's some double talk, I think. For example, this week, Christopher Lamb published a piece in the Tablet about Cardinal Sarah and his resistance to Pope Francis. And there was a lot of pushback from people who would never call themselves supporters of Pope Francis, but who were attacking him for writing what they deemed a hit piece on the cardinal. Do you find this double talk frustrating? I mean, I certainly do. Another example was that story about the ad limina visit with the American bishops that was provided an account of the events of that meeting with the Pope, wherein he supposedly spoke negatively of Father James Martin and his approach. And to me, even though the story relied on anonymous sources and 2 other bishops came forward on the record with their names behind it and said that account was false, I feel like in a way they were almost defending Pope Francis in their minds by saying, look, here's an example of him trashing this priest that we all agree is terrible. And God forbid Pope Francis say anything good or have any positive thoughts about them. And we were counterattacked for trying to point out the facts of the matter. Does any of this resonate with you? I guess the thing is there are multiple levels to this resistance, and some are more subtle than others. And at least in the US, probably in Britain, probably in the entire Anglosphere, this narrative seems to have caught hold among a great many faithful Catholics.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, yes, I agree with your distinction. There is, of course, a distinction between EWTN, National Catholic Register, CNA, that constellation of conservative Catholic American media, and what I might call the lunatic fringe of Church Militant and Taylor Marshall and so on, who I don't think actually mainstream conservatives take seriously. In fact, as you know, Archbishop Chaput, one of Francis's great critics when he was Archbishop of Philadelphia, wouldn't allow Church Militant in his his diocese. And so, of course, we have to make that's a very, very important distinction. But I'm not troubled by the lunatic fringe, because there always has been one, and there's a traditionalist wing which will attack Vatican II and attack every pope since Vatican II. That's just part of the background noise no. But what EWTN does is something new and something different, and this is where I agree with you. It is the strategy of recognize and resist. We will outwardly defer to his authority. We will be respectful towards the position and so on. But in reality, we will filter everything through a particular lens, which is effectively to judge the authority of the papacy in the light of what we understand to be tradition of the previous two popes. And of course, let's not forget, and the example you gave of James Martin, where Peter has played a very important role in clarifying what happened. But let's take the obvious example of the astonishing attack on Pope Francis by Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano in 2018, when, it was all done through EWTN. EWTN released the document. It was arranged with them. They were part of the communications operation that enabled the Vigano attack to occur. Now, that's where you see the alliances, the ideological alliances, and of course you see it in the example you just gave of Edward Pentin, who I know very well as the Register's Vatican correspondent, always basically interviews Burke and Sarah. And what they're erecting is a kind of a counter-magisterium. They're saying, and Cardinal Muller, they're saying there's confusion in the church. The Pope effectively can't be trusted with the safeguarding of doctrine. Therefore, we have to constantly interview these two or three superannuated figures in whom we have deposited the task of ensuring fidelity to the continuity of tradition. And that's the technique, that's the strategy. That's why I call it recognize and resist. And that's the one that you're seeing in a very sophisticated way being operated by EWTN. And I say it's sophisticated because of what you say, which is that outwardly it's not to be confused with the rabid lunatic fringe which just attacks. It's more subtle, but I think far more, in many ways, far more pernicious, because it lacks integrity. To me, you mentioned Christopher Lamb was just debating the BBC here with Ed Condon, canon lawyer out of Washington, and Condon saying, look, you can't say that this is any kind of schism. It's not like the 1980s when you had the Lefebvrist schism. But in many ways, you see, the Lefebvrist schism was much more honest. It was saying we don't recognize the authority of this papacy, of this modern papacy. Therefore, we have to formally declare our schism from it. This is different. This is no. We recognize the papacy, but we don't recognize the teaching authority of its incumbent. And
I know that some might criticize you or where Peter is for paying attention, so much attention to this stuff. But now something that you said though before, I can't remember exactly where, but you had said that when you look at the tensions that are going on here in this resistance to Pope Francis, you actually can learn a lot about the ways that the church is being converted and this whole process of conversion that Pope Francis is taking us through. And I've seen that. I saw that almost right from the election of Pope Francis, that there was a whole world of Catholic media that I thought was fairly stable and had some real integrity. And I've just seen it come under just such immense strain as it's putting up this sort of front. And I wonder if you could maybe expand on what this is stemming from, this sort of resistance in terms of, you've mentioned the idea of we're seeing the sort of pharisaical view of things playing out here in real time in a very instructional way. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, thanks, David. No, well, I think it is striking, isn't it, how things have changed in the last 7 years. When my biography, The Great Reformer, came out in 2014, I was associated at the time mainly with a project called Catholic Voices in the UK, and we were out there defending church position, for example, on gay marriage on television. That was we were considered to be people who defended the church and so on. And I have a book called How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice, which was co-written with a well-known kind of conservative author in the United States, Catherine Lopez. And so I was interviewed when The Great Reformer came out. I was interviewed on all the EWTN type media. Now, interestingly, last November when Wounded Shepherd came out, not a single invitation. I was in Argentine Spanish. They have a wonderful verb, which is ningunear. I was nobodied. You just completely ignored and sidelined. And that's a reflection of the change. So there has been a shift in the last few years. So what's happened is that the people who were worried about Francis in 2014, who I spent a lot of my time kind of trying to reassure, at some point, and I think it was around 2016, they lost trust, they lost confidence. I think it was between Laudato Si and Amoris Laetitia, which I think both pressed buttons which were sacred in many ways to culture warriors. Now, on the subject of the kind of culture war, you've got a terrific piece where Peter is on this. And I think a lot of it in America has to do with the culture wars, which is a beleaguered mindset, which says that our primary task in life and the primary task of religion is to resist liberal modernity, the threat to the family, individualism, relativism, and so on. And in that battle, which is fundamentally a cultural and ideological battle, the church must be an ally. The church is a kind of our refuge, our banner. And therefore, anything which appears to concede to the enemy has to be resisted. And it's this what Francis is about. And I think in a way it's incapable, and I'll win myself even fewer friends for saying this, but it's not what the gospel is about. In other words, it's a mentality that resists the fundamental message of the gospel, which is the unconditional love and mercy of God for all people, independently of who they are. So that the relationship with God, religion, truth, doctrine, tradition, are not weapons to be used against people, but rather mechanisms by which we facilitate people's access to life in God. Okay. And this, of course, in a way is the heart of the battle of Jesus with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are good. They're good, upstanding, upright people. They're moral crusaders, if you like. And they believe in all the right things in the law. But what they're doing is that for them, it's all about demarcation. Who is with us and who is against us? Who are, as Thomas Merton once said, there are people who want the church to declare themselves innocent and others guilty. And it's this idea which Francis has often spoken about. It is this idea which is deeply divisive. This is ideology. It's not at the heart of the gospel. So I think there is a lot of this going on in the ferment around Francis. There is, particularly in America, which I've likened in the book to 19th century France. You see, in France, post-revolution, 19th century France, if you were Catholic, you had to be part of the forces of reaction in favor of the monarchy against the revolution. There were two tribes in France. If you were Catholic, you had to be on that tribe. And it was only Leo XIII and later in the 19th century that got broken. And Francis is breaking that alliance in America. And that's part of the big ferment, I think, that his papacy has caused in the United States. And why people who I think felt that they owned the papacy, they owned the church, the church was theirs in this battle, suddenly find themselves dispossessed of that authority that they had arrogated to themselves. And boy, are they pissed.
I wanted to say that, I've personally experienced some of this transformation from a kind of culture war attitude to where I think Pope Francis is trying to lead Catholics. I went through it with Laudato Si. Actually, when that came out, I was very worried that is this going to basically ally the church with the sort of environmentalist movement, which at the time I was a little suspect about. And I'm being frank that I had to kind of be led kicking and screaming into the world of Laudato Si, and now I'm very comfortable there. I wanted to know if I know that in some ways you were kind of ahead of the curve here with the Catholic Voices, trying to sort of defuse some of this culture war rhetoric. But were there ways that you had to be sort of led into a new way of thinking as well through what Pope Francis has been telling us? Or were there any things that you resisted or had any trouble with when it came to what Francis was asking us to do as Catholics?
I guess I've always, from the very beginning, felt I understood him and I wanted to follow him. In other words, I guess from the beginning, I trusted Francis. But it's interesting that I'm often painted as a kind of a liberal who rejected Benedict and was just waiting for a progressive to come along. It was the opposite. I was a great fan of Benedict. I mean, I think, David, you and I are very similar in this. And by the way, I applauded Benedict's attempt to engage the world of ecology in a discussion, and I was with Benedict when he challenged, the world of ecology to be pro-life, when it wasn't, and so on. I was a great fan of Benedict. But then I think when Francis came along, I saw what he was trying to do, I think, very early on. And I think that partly got to do with my own background and my knowledge of the Argentine church and so on. So, that's what led me to write the biography, was this curiosity about him. But look, generally, does Francis challenge me? Absolutely. He challenges them. I mean, your story about, oh my gosh, Laudato Si, you'd be feeling nervous. Is he going to go take us down this road? I remember feeling the same. And in a way, that's right, isn't it? I mean, we're supposed to be challenged by the Pope. The Pope isn't there simply to reassure us. It's exactly the same and I use the analogy in the book, in the late 19th century when Leo XIII produced the first great social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, which was precisely about the relations between capital and labor, which dominated, of course, the politics of the time. And at least half of the bourgeois Catholics of Europe said when Rerum Novarum came out, the Pope's gone mad. What does he know about economics? What does he know about wages and trade unions? And there was an instinctive rejection because they were so busy fighting socialism that the Pope coming along and saying, well, there is a thing called a just wage, and yes, we have a right to trade unions, was read as being, aligning the church with those forces which they had been resisting. So what's going on here is a purification of the people of God, which is in a way part of the job of every papacy, is to purify us, because actually we're all too bound up with the ideological and political battles of our day. And, I can remember, I was younger with John Paul II, and I never felt the affinity with John Paul that I felt with Benedict. But nonetheless, I hugely admired John Paul II. And he endlessly challenged me, particularly in my, thoughts on politics and so on. And that, as I say, that is the job. When we say that Peter teaches, we don't mean Peter tells us what we want to hear and tells us how wonderful we are because we say this, we believe this stuff. No, Peter challenges us, just as Jesus challenged his disciples.
I just want to share that my own story is similar as well. My upbringing was essentially a reactionary conservative Catholic. I saw the faith as a list of rules. I felt very rigid. At some point in my late 20s, it dawned on me that I'd never derived a single feeling of joy from my faith in my entire life. But yet I had read all these things that spoke about things like joy and happiness and inner peace. And it was actually the writings of Pope Benedict that really astounded me. In his Deus Caritas Est, I believe that's where he spoke about the faith. It isn't a list of rules, but it's an encounter with the person of Jesus Christ. And that kind of started me on my journey, along with befriending a couple of really strong social justice oriented Catholics who, lo and behold, they weren't dissenters on key moral issues. I met a couple of really well-balanced priests who both had a heart for the poor. And early on in Francis's papacy, and David and I discussed this in the last podcast, I started to wonder, okay, so these traditionalists, they keep coming up with this is what the church really teaches. This thing that the Vatican put out is terrible. I mean, there's the famous George Weigel red and gold pen essay about Sacramentum Caritatis by Pope Benedict. And a priest friend of mine, I really wanted to know, well, how do we know when the Pope might be teaching error? How do we know when his teaching is binding? And he pointed me towards the CDF document that Ratzinger wrote in 1998 about the primacy of the successor of Peter. And I started reading Pius X and Pius IX, Vatican I, Pope Leo, John Paul's 10 papal audiences on the Pope that I actually have been writing about recently. I'm up to number 2. And with that, and with my commitment to Catholicism, I made a conscious decision to trust the Pope and to see it through. Yet, as you've observed, as David's observed, a lot of what we thought were our comrades in arms during the Benedict papacy, our brothers and sisters in the faith, didn't see it that way. I honestly thought that now that I understood papal primacy, that I assumed they understood it better than I did. And what I found was that they have this, they believe in some sort of external abstract orthodoxy that the Pope can either choose to accept or choose to teach, or he can deviate from it. We talk about these mainstream media outlets that are opposing Pope Francis. And one of the things that stands out to me is that they never, ever challenge Cardinal Burke, who promotes specifically this idea that we can I believe he said it's our duty to disobey the Pope when he teaches against the perennial magisterium of the Church. The Church is both and. We believe that not only is it the Pope's job to teach when he teaches magisterially, but we also believe that when he teaches magisterially, we're bound to assent to it. So, and I think the thing that really kind of pushed me over the edge was reading Stephen Walford's essays in La Stampa in the Vatican Insider. That was a real big change for me. Or it was a realization that, wow, I'm not the only one who thinks this way. But when did it begin to occur to you that people were beginning, other Catholics, maybe that you were friends with, or you had discussed the faith, that they were starting to sour on Francis? And what was your response? Did you find that anything that you were saying was effective in helping them to understand where Francis was coming from and how he was consistent with the magisterium, how he wasn't breaking the faith, but he was changing the emphasis and reminding us of things that perhaps we had forgotten?
Well, I mean, that was part of the motivation for writing The Great Reformer, was that I felt back in 2013, in the months after his election, that he was being misinterpreted by conservatives, but also by kind of liberal Catholics, and so if you've read The Great Reformer, one of the big themes of it is that this is no liberal. He's a radical in the gospel tradition, and he's in the Jesuit Ignatian tradition, but he's absolutely not liberal, but he's not a conservative either. And so that's what I set out to describe in The Great Reformer. And a lot of people told me after reading that book, I mean, kind of more conservative people, that I had really helped to reconcile them with Francis, and they really understood then what he was about, and that they realized that these fears were misplaced. But I also was aware that there were people who either weren't reading the book, didn't want to read the book, and then made up their mind. And so there was this kind of separating of the waters. I mean, David was talking about, I think it occurs in 2015, and then moving into 2016, the disaffection hardens into resistance among this certain group. Now, it's mysterious partly. Why is it some people go some way and one people go another? And I'm sure we've all got anecdotes about this, about particular friends but I think, I just want to go back to your quote, because what Benedict says, Deus Caritas Est, he says, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea. The encounter with a person, he doesn't actually say Jesus Christ, but it's implied, who changes your horizon. It is the encounter with the person. In Luigi Giussani's word, it is the event, it is the encounter that is transformative. That's the basis of everything. Then your whole life changes, your outlook, your hermeneutic changes. And, Bergoglio, I quoted Cardinal Bergoglio saying in 2012 in a retreat, the woman who has the encounter with Christ in John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery, do you think she went back to her former life? And he says, no, she can't have done, because nobody who has experienced that much mercy can ignore the law after that, or it's the consequence. So, the moral conversion, this is as old as Augustine. Are we good? Does God love us because we're good, or are we good because God first loved us? Right now, I think Benedict understands this. Francis understands this. All the greats understand this, but and I think Benedict spotted the problem, which is why I've always seen an essential continuity between these two papacies. Now, interestingly, that quote in Deus Caritas Est appears very early on in the Aparecida document, the document of the Latin American bishops of May 2007, which I'm sure you've heard me say endlessly is the basis for this pontificate. Aparecida is, the diagnosis of modernity and so on. Now, it appears very early on in that document. It appears again in Evangelii Gaudium, where Francis says, I never tire of this quote because it takes us to the heart of the gospel. It appears, I could go on. It appears, it's like a theme, there's almost a drumbeat throughout this pontificate. And I think that is the heart of the matter. I think for those who have had that encounter with Christ, whether through people that they've met or through a contemplative experience or through a particular experience of suffering that has led them to, they get Francis and they understand him. And I think there are people who have clung to an idea of what Catholicism is, and I say it's an idea because it is fundamentally a mental fixation. Now, I'm delighted we're having this conversation because we've all got, we've all been on a journey, and I really do. I know I can be quite harsh with Francis's critics, but I really am very unjudgmental about people because I've been there myself. I was in my 20s, was a refuge from liberal relativism, and I went through a kind of semi-fundamentalist, rigid phase, along with, I'm sure, you guys, because when you're rejecting something, you go to the opposite. So you're rejecting liberal relativism. So you look for something that's hard, objective, rigid, stands outside time, and so on. Okay, and you latch onto it, for dear life. And you can see this in so many, that's why, and I've got into trouble for saying this, but so many of the fiercest critics of Francis are converts, not just converts from other denominations, but converts, refugees from liberal relativism who have experienced the anomie and the fragmentation of the contemporary world. They hate it. They're looking to belong. They're looking for God. They're looking for all those things. They're searchers. But rather than seeking, and humbly and in a broken way, seeking that encounter with Christ, they've latched on to a series of doctrines and presuppositions and ideologies, which, because they have been derated, because they've been torn away from their roots in the encounter with Christ, they have turned then into an ideology. And that's what Francis means when he warns us against Pelagianism and Gnosticism. It is, this stuff looks very religious. It's got Catholic written all over it. It's literally got smells and bells. But at the heart of it, there is something missing, which is the incarnation.
Well, this concludes part 1 of our podcast interview with the great Austen Ivereigh. I want to thank David Lafferty for joining us. Please tune in next time when we speak to Austen about Pope Francis in a post-COVID world and how the Church will move forward and evangelize from here. Until next time, take care.